Chapter 7, Part 1 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 7, Part 1. The Cuneiform Inscription. The surprise which Thorndyke's proceedings usually occasioned, especially to lawyers, was principally due, I think, to my friend's habit of viewing occurrences from an unusual standpoint. He did not look at things quite as other men looked at them. He had no prejudices, and he knew no conventions. When other men were cocksure, Thorndyke was doubtful. When other men despaired, he entertained hopes. And thus it happened that he would often undertake cases that had been rejected contemptuously by experienced lawyers, and what is more, would bring them to a successful issue. Thus it had been in the only other case in which I had been personally associated with him, the so-called Red Thumb Mark case. There he was presented with an apparent impossibility, but he had given it careful consideration. Then, from the category of the impossible, he had brought it to that of the possible, from the merely possible to the actually probable, from the probable to the certain, and in the end had won the case triumphantly. Was it conceivable that he could make anything of the present case? He had not declined it. He had certainly entertained it, and was probably thinking it over at this moment. Yet could anything be more impossible? Here was the case of a man making his own will, probably writing it out himself, bringing it voluntarily to a certain place, and executing it in the presence of competent witnesses. There was no suggestion of any compulsion, or even influence or persuasion. The testator was admittedly sane and responsible, and if the will did not give effect to his wishes, which, however, could not be proved, that was due to his own carelessness in drafting the will, and not to any unusual circumstances. And the problem which Thorndyke seemed to be considering was how to set aside that will. I reviewed the statements that I had heard, but turn them about as I would, I could get nothing out of them but confirmation of Mr. Marchmont's estimate of the case. One fact that I had noted with some curiosity I again considered. That was Thorndyke's evident desire to inspect Jeffrey Blackmore's chambers. He had, it is true, shown no eagerness, but I had seen at the time that the questions which he put to Stephen were put, not with any expectation of eliciting information, but for the purpose of getting an opportunity to look over the rooms himself. I was still cogitating on the subject when my colleague returned, followed by the watchful Polton with the tea tray, and I attacked him forthwith. "Well, Thorndyke," I said, "I have been thinking about this Blackmore case while you have been gadding about." "And may I take it that the problem is solved?" "No. I'm hanged if you may. I can make nothing of it." "Then you are in much the same position as I am." "But if you can make nothing of it, why did you undertake it?" "I only undertook it to think about it," said Thorndyke. "I never reject a case offhand unless it is obviously fishy. It is surprising how difficulties and even impossibilities dwindle if you look at them attentively. My experience has taught me that the most unlikely case is at least worth thinking over. By the way, why do you want to look over Jeffrey's chambers? What do you expect to find there?" "I have no expectations at all. I am simply looking for stray facts." "And all those questions that you asked Stephen Blackmore, had you nothing in your mind? No definite purpose?" No purpose beyond getting to know as much about the case as I can." "But," I exclaimed, "do you mean that you are going to examine those rooms without any definite object at all?" "I wouldn't say that," replied Thorndyke. "This is a legal case. Let me put an analogous medical case as being more within your present sphere. Supposing that a man should consult you, say, about a progressive loss of weight. He can give no explanation. He has no pain, no discomfort, no symptoms of any kind. In short, he feels perfectly well in every respect, but he is losing weight continuously. What would you do?" "I should overhaul him thoroughly," I answered. "Why? What would you expect to find?" "I don't know that I should start by expecting to find anything in particular, but I should overhaul him organ by organ and function by function, and if I could find nothing abnormal, I should have to give it up." "Exactly," said Thorndyke, "and that is just my position and my line of action. Here is a case which is perfectly regular and straightforward excepting in one respect. It has a single abnormal feature, and for that abnormality there is nothing to account. Jeffrey Blackmore made a will. It was a well drawn will, and it apparently gave full effect to his intentions. Then he revoked that will and made another. No change had occurred in his circumstances or in his intentions. The provisions of the new will were believed by him to be identical with those of the old one. The new will differed from the old one only in having a defect in the drafting, from which the first will was free, and of which he must have been unaware. Now, why did he revoke the first will and replace it with another which he believed to be identical in its provisions? There is no answer to that question. It is an abnormal feature in the case. There must be some explanation of that abnormality, and it is my business to discover it. But the facts in my possession yield no such explanation. Therefore, it is my purpose to search for new facts which may give me a starting point for an investigation." This exposition of Thorndyke's proposed conduct of the case, reasonable as it was, did not impress me as very convincing. I found myself coming back to Marchmont's position, that there was really nothing in dispute. But other matters claimed our attention at the moment, and it was not until after dinner that my colleague reverted to the subject. "How should you like to take a turn round to New Inn this evening?" he asked. "I should have thought," said I, "that it would be better to go by daylight. Those old chambers are not usually very well illuminated." "That is well thought of," said Thorndyke. "We had better take a lamp with us. Let us go up to the laboratory and get one from Polton." "There is no need to do that," said I. "The pocket lamp that you lent me is in my overcoat pocket. I put it there to return to you." "Did you have occasion to use it?" he asked. "Yes. I paid another visit to the mysterious house and carried out your plan. I must tell you about it later." "Do. I shall be keenly interested to hear all about your adventures. Is there plenty of candle left in the lamp?" "Oh, yes. I only used it for about an hour." "Then let us be off," said Thorndyke, and we accordingly set forth on our quest, and as we went I reflected once more on the apparent vagueness of our proceedings. Presently I reopened the subject with Thorndyke. "I can't imagine," said I, "that you have absolutely nothing in view; that you are going to this place with no defined purpose whatever." "I did not say exactly that," replied Thorndyke. "I said that I was not going to look for any particular thing or fact. I am going in the hope that I may observe something that may start a new train of speculation. But that is not all. You know that an investigation follows a certain logical course. It begins with the observation of the conspicuous facts. We have done that. The facts were supplied by Marchmont. The next stage is to propose to oneself one or more provisional explanations or hypotheses. We have done that, too. Or, at least, I have, and I suppose you have." "I haven't," said I. "There is Jeffrey's will, but why he should have made the change I cannot form the foggiest idea. But I should like to hear your provisional theories on the subject." "You won't hear them at present. They are mere wild conjectures. But to resume, what do we do next?" "Go to New Inn and rake over the deceased gentleman's apartments." Thorndyke smilingly ignored my answer and continued: "We examine each explanation in turn, and see what follows from it, whether it agrees with all the facts and leads to the discovery of new ones, or, on the other hand, disagrees with some facts or leads us to an absurdity. Let us take a simple example. Suppose we find scattered over a field a number of largish masses of stone, which are entirely different in character from the rocks found in the neighborhood. The question arises, how did those stones get into that field? 3 explanations are proposed. 1, that they are the products of former volcanic action. 2, that they were brought from a distance by human agency. 3, that they were carried thither from some distant country by icebergs. Now, each of those explanations involves certain consequences. If the stones are volcanic, then they were once in a state of fusion. But we find that they are unaltered limestone and contain fossils. Then they are not volcanic. If they were born by icebergs, then they were once part of a glacier, and some of them will probably show the flat surfaces with parallel scratches which are found on glacier-borne stones. We examine them and find the characteristic scratched surfaces. Then they have probably been brought to this place by icebergs. But this does not exclude human agency, for they might have been brought by men to this place from some other where the icebergs had deposited them. A further comparison with other facts would be needed. So we proceed in cases like this present one. Of the facts that are known to us, we invent certain explanations. From each of those explanations we deduce consequences, and if those consequences agree with new facts, they confirm the explanation, whereas if they disagree, they tend to disprove it. But here we are at our destination." We turned out of White Street into the arched passage leading into New Inn, and, halting at the half door of the lodge, perceived a stout, purple-faced man crouching over the fire, coughing violently. He held up his hand to intimate that he was fully occupied for the moment, and we accordingly waited for his paroxysm to subside. At length he turned towards us, wiping his eyes, and inquired our business. "Mr. Stephen Blackmore," said Thorndyke, "has given me permission to look over his chambers. He said that he would mention the matter to you." "So he has, sir," said the porter. "But he has just taken the key himself to go to the chambers. If you walk across the inn you'll find him there. It's on the farther side, number 31, second floor." We made our way across to the house indicated, the ground floor of which was occupied by a solicitor's offices and was distinguished by a good-sized brass plate. Although it had now been dark some time, there was no light on the lower stairs, but we encountered on the first-floor landing a man who had just lit the lamp there. Thorndyke halted to address him. "Can you tell me who occupies the chambers on the 3rd floor?" "The 3rd floor has been empty about 3 months," was the reply. "We are going up to look at the chambers on the 2nd floor," said Thorndyke. "Are they pretty quiet?" "Quiet!" exclaimed the man. "Lord bless you, the place is like a cemetery for the deaf and dumb. There's the solicitors on the ground floor and the architects on the 1st floor. They both clear out about 6, and when they're gone the house is as empty as a blown hegg. I don't wonder poor Mr. Blackmore made away with hisself. Livin' up there all alone, it must have been like Robinson Crusoe without no man Friday, and not even a bloomin' goat to talk to. Quiet! It's quiet enough, if that's what you want. Wouldn't be no good to me." With a contemptuous shake of the head, he turned and retired down the next flight, and as the echoes of his footsteps died away, we resumed our ascent. "So it would appear," Thorndyke commented, "that when Jeffrey Blackmore came home that last evening the house was empty." Arrived on the second floor landing, we were confronted by a solid looking door on the lintel of which the deceased man's name was painted in white lettering which still looked new and fresh. Thorndyke knocked at the door, which was at once opened by Stephen Blackmore. "I haven't wasted any time before taking advantage of your permission, you see," my colleague said as we entered. "No, indeed," said Stephen. "You are very prompt. I have been rather wondering what kind of information you expect to gather from an inspection of these rooms." Thorndyke smiled genially, amused no doubt by the similarity of Stephen's remarks to those of mine which he had so recently criticized. "A man of science, Mr. Blackmore," he said, "expects nothing. He collects facts and keeps an open mind. As to me, I am a mere legal Autolycus, a snapper up of unconsidered trifles of evidence. When I have accumulated a few facts, I arrange them, compare them, and think about them. Sometimes the comparison yields new matter and sometimes it doesn't. But in any case, believe me, it is a capital error to decide beforehand what data are to be sought for." "Yes, I suppose that is so," said Stephen, "though to me it almost looks as if Mr. Marchmont was right, that there is nothing to investigate." "You should have thought of that before you consulted me," laughed Thorndyke. "As it is, I am engaged to look into the case, and I shall do so. And, as I have said, I shall keep an open mind until I have all the facts in my possession." He glanced round the sitting room which we had now entered and continued: "These are fine, dignified old rooms. It seems a sin to have covered up all this oak panelling and that carved cornice and mantel with paint. Think what it must have been like when the beautiful figured wood was exposed." "It would be very dark," Stephen observed. "Yes," Thorndyke agreed, "and I suppose we care more for light and less for beauty than our ancestors did. But now, tell me, looking round these rooms, do they convey to you a similar impression to that which the old rooms did? Have they the same general character?" "Not quite, I think. Of course the rooms in Jermyn Street were in a different kind of house, but beyond that I seem to feel a certain difference, which is rather odd, seeing that the furniture is the same. But the old rooms were more cosy, more homelike. I find something rather bare and cheerless, I was almost going to say squalid, in the look of these chambers." "That is rather what I should have expected," said Thorndyke. "The opium habit alters a man's character profoundly, and somehow, apart from the mere furnishing, a room reflects in some subtle way, but very distinctly, the personality of its occupant, especially when that occupant lives a solitary life. Do you see any evidence of the activities that used to occupy your uncle?" "Not very much," replied Stephen, "but the place may not be quite as he left it. I found one or two of his books on the table and put them back in the shelves, but I found no manuscript or notes such as he used to make. I noticed, too, that his ink slab, which he used to keep so scrupulously clean, is covered with dry smears, and that the stick of ink is all cracked at the end, as if he had not used it for months. It seems to point to a great change in his habits." "What used he to do with Chinese ink?" Thorndyke asked. "He corresponded with some of his native friends in Japan, and he used to write in the Japanese character, even if they understood English. That was what he chiefly used the Chinese ink for. But he also used to copy the inscriptions from these things." Here Stephen lifted from the mantelpiece what looked like a fossil bath bun, but was actually a clay tablet covered with minute indented writing. Your uncle could read the cuneiform character, then? Yes, he was something of an expert. These tablets are, I believe, leases and other legal documents from Eridu and other Babylonian cities. He used to copy the inscriptions in the cuneiform writing and then translate them into English. But I mustn't stay here any longer, as I have an engagement for this evening. I just dropped in to get these 2 volumes, Thornton's History of Babylonia, which he once advised me to read. Shall I give you the key? You'd better have it and leave it with the porter as you go out." He shook hands with us, and we walked out with him to the landing and stood watching him as he ran down the stairs, glancing at Thorndyke by the light of the gas lamp on the landing. I thought I detected in his impassive face that almost imperceptible change of expression to which I have already alluded as indicating pleasure or satisfaction. "You are looking quite pleased with yourself," I remarked. "I am not displeased," he replied calmly. "Autolycus has picked up a few crumbs, very small ones, but still crumbs. No doubt his learned junior has picked up a few likewise." I shook my head, and inwardly suspected it of being rather a thick head. "I did not perceive anything in the least degree significant in what Stephen was telling you," said I. "It was all very interesting, but it did not seem to have any bearing on his uncle's will." "I was not referring only to what Stephen has told us, although that was, as you say, very interesting. While he was talking I was looking about the room, and I have seen a very strange thing. Let me show it to you." He linked his arm in mine, and, walking me back into the room, halted opposite the fireplace. "There," said he, "look at that. It is a most remarkable object. Illustration: the inverted inscription. I followed the direction of his gaze and saw an oblong frame enclosing a large photograph of an inscription in the weird and cabalistic arrowhead character. I looked at it in silence for some seconds, and then, somewhat disappointed, remarked: "I don't see anything very remarkable in it, under the circumstances. In any ordinary room it would be, I admit, but Stephen has just told us that his uncle was something of an expert in cuneiform writing." "Exactly," said Thorndyke. "That is my point. That is what makes it so remarkable." "I don't follow you at all," said I. "That a man should hang upon his wall an inscription that is legible to him does not seem to me at all out of the way. It would be much more singular if he should hang up an inscription that he could not read." "No doubt," replied Thorndyke. "But you will agree with me that it would be still more singular if a man should hang upon his wall an inscription that he could read, and hang it upside down." I stared at Thorndyke in amazement. "Do you mean to tell me," I exclaimed, "that that photograph is really upside down?" "I do indeed," he replied. "But how do you know? Have we here yet another Oriental scholar?" Thorndyke chuckled. "Some fool," he replied, "has said that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Compared with much knowledge it may be, but it is a vast deal better than no knowledge. Here is a case in point. I have read with very keen interest the wonderful history of the decipherment of the cuneiform writing, and I happen to recollect one or two of the main facts that seem to me to be worth remembering. This particular inscription is in the Persian cuneiform, a much more simple and open form of the script than the Babylonian or Assyrian. In fact, I suspect that this is the famous inscription from the gateway at Persepolis, the first to be deciphered, which would account for its presence here in a frame. Now, this script consists, as you see, of 2 kinds of characters: the small, solid, acutely pointed characters which are known as wedges, and the larger, more obtuse characters, somewhat like our government broad arrows, and called arrowheads. The names are rather unfortunate, as both forms are wedge like and both resemble arrowheads. The script reads from left to right, like our own writing, and unlike that of the Semitic peoples and the primitive Greeks. And the rule for the placing of the characters is that all the wedges point to the right or downwards, and the arrowhead forms are open towards the right. But if you look at this photograph, you will see that all the wedges point upwards to the left, and that the arrowhead characters are open towards the left. Obviously, the photograph is upside down." "But," I exclaimed, "this is really most mysterious. What do you suppose can be the explanation?" "I think," replied Thorndyke, "that we may perhaps get a suggestion from the back of the frame. Let us see." End of Chapter 7, Part 1. Recording by James O'Connor, Randolph, Massachusetts, December 2009. Part 2 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 7. The Cuneiform Inscription. Part 2. He disengaged the frame from the two nails on which it hung, and, turning it round, glanced at the back, which he then presented for my inspection. A label on the backing paper bore the words, "J. Budge, Frame Maker and Gilder, 16 Great Ann Street, W.C." "Well," I said, when I had read the label, without gathering from it anything fresh, "the label, you observe, is the right way up as it hangs on the wall." "So it is," I rejoined hastily, a little annoyed that I had not been quicker to observe so obvious a fact. "I see your point. You mean that the frame maker hung the thing upside down, and Jeffrey never noticed the mistake?" "That is a perfectly sound explanation," said Thorndyke, "but I think there is something more. You will notice that the label is an old one. It must have been on some years, to judge by its dingy appearance, whereas the two mirror plates look to me comparatively new. But we can soon put that matter to the test, for the label was evidently stuck on when the frame was new, and if the plates were screwed on at the same time, the wood that they cover will be clean and new looking." He drew from his pocket a combination knife, containing among other implements a screwdriver, with which he carefully extracted the screws from one of the little brass plates by which the frame had been suspended from the nails. "You see," he said, when he had removed the plate and carried the photograph over to the gas jet, "the wood covered by the plate is as dirty and time stained as the rest of the frame. The plates have been put on recently." "And what are we to infer from that?" "Well, since there are no other marks of plates or rings upon the frame, we may safely infer that the photograph was never hung up until it came to these rooms." "Yes, I suppose we may. But what then? What inference does that lead to?" Thorndyke reflected for a few moments, and I continued: "It is evident that this photograph suggests more to you than it does to me. I should like to hear your exposition of its bearing on the case, if it has any." "Whether or no it has any real bearing on the case," Thorndyke answered, "it is impossible for me to say at this stage. I told you that I had proposed to myself one or two hypotheses to account for and explain Jeffrey Blackmore's will, and I may say that the curious misplacement of this photograph fits more than one of them. I won't say more than that, because I think it would be profitable to you to work at this case independently. You have all the facts that I have, and you shall have a copy of my notes of Marchmont's statement of the case. With this material you ought to be able to reach some conclusion. Of course, neither of us may be able to make anything of the case, It doesn't look very hopeful at present. But whatever happens, we can compare notes after the event, and you will be the richer by so much experience of actual investigation. But I will start you off with one hint, which is this: that neither you nor Marchmont seem to appreciate in the least the very extraordinary nature of the facts that he communicated to us." "I thought Marchmont seemed pretty much alive to the fact that it was a very queer will." "So he did," agreed Thorndyke, "but that is not quite what I mean. The whole set of circumstances, taken together and in relation to one another, impressed me as most remarkable, and that is why I am giving so much attention to what looks at first sight like such a very unpromising case. Copy out my notes, Jervis, and examine the facts critically. I think you will see what I mean. And now let us proceed." He replaced the brass plate and, having reinserted the screws, hung up the frame, and proceeded to browse slowly round the room, stopping now and again to inspect the Japanese colour prints and framed photographs of buildings and other objects of archaeological interest that formed the only attempts at wall decoration. To one of the former he drew my attention. "These things are of some value," he remarked. "Here is one by Utamaro. That little circle with the mark over it is his signature. And you notice that the paper is becoming spotted in places with mildew. The fact is worth noting in more than one connection." I accordingly made a mental note, and the perambulation continued. "You observe that Jeffrey used a gas stove instead of a coal fire. No doubt to economize work, but perhaps for other reasons. Presumably he cooked by gas too. Let us see." We wandered into the little cupboard-like kitchen and glanced round. A ring burner on a shelf, a kettle, a frying pan, and a few pieces of crockery were its sole appointments. Apparently the porter was correct in his statement as to Jeffrey's habits. Returning to the sitting room, Thorndyke resumed his inspection, pulling out the table drawers, peering inquisitively into cupboards, and bestowing a passing glance on each of the comparatively few objects that the comfortless room contained. "I have never seen a more characterless apartment," was his final comment. "There is nothing that seems to suggest any kind of habitual activity on the part of the occupant. Let us look at the bedroom." We passed through into the chamber of tragic memories, and when Thorndyke had lit the gas, we stood a while looking about us in silence. It was a bare, comfortless room, dirty, neglected, and squalid. The bed appeared not to have been remade since the catastrophe, for an indentation still marked the place where the corpse had lain, and even a slight powdering of ash could still be seen on the shabby counterpane. It looked to me a typical opium smoker's bedroom. "Well," Thorndyke remarked at length, "there is character enough here, of a kind. Jeffrey Blackmore would seem to have been a man of few needs. One could hardly imagine a bedroom in which less attention seemed to have been given to the comfort of the occupant." He looked about him keenly and continued: "The syringe and the rest of the lethal appliances and material have been taken away, I see. Probably the analyst did not return them, but there are the opium pipe and the jar and the ash bowl. And I presume those are the clothes that the undertakers removed from the body. Shall we look them over?" He took up the clothes which lay, roughly folded, on a chair, and held them up garment by garment. "These are evidently the trousers," he remarked, spreading them out on the bed. "Here is a little white spot on the middle of the thigh which looks like a patch of small crystals from a drop of the solution. Just light the lamp, Jervis, and let us examine it with a lens." I lit the lamp, and when we had examined the spot minutely and identified it as a mass of minute crystals, Thorndyke asked: "What do you make of those creases? You see there is one on each leg." "It looks as if the trousers had been turned up, but if they have been, they must have been turned up about 7 inches. Poor Jeffrey couldn't have had much regard for appearances, for they would have been right above his socks. But perhaps the creases were made in undressing the body." "That is possible," said Thorndyke, "though I don't quite see how it would have happened. I notice that his pockets seem to have been emptied. No, wait. Here is something in the waistcoat pocket." He drew out a shabby pigskin card case and a stump of lead pencil, at which latter he looked with what seemed to me much more interest than was deserved by so commonplace an object. "The cards, you observe," said he, "are printed from type, not from a plate. I would note that fact. And tell me what you make of that." He handed me the pencil, which I examined with concentrated attention, helping myself even with the lamp and my pocket lens. But even with these aids I failed to discover anything unusual in its appearance. Thorndyke watched me with a mischievous smile, and when I had finished, inquired, "Well, what is it?" "Confound you!" I exclaimed. "It's a pencil. Any fool can see that, and this particular fool can't see any more. It's a wretched stump of a pencil, villainously cut to an abominably bad point. It is coloured dark red on the outside, and was stamped with some name that began with C.O. Co-operative Stores, perhaps." "Now, my dear Jervis," Thorndyke protested, "don't begin by confusing speculation with fact. The letters which remain are C.O. Note that fact, and find out what pencils there are which have inscriptions beginning with those letters. I am not going to help you, because you can easily do this for yourself, and it will be good discipline even if the fact turns out to mean nothing." At this moment he stepped back suddenly and, looking down at the floor, said, "Give me the lamp, Jervis. I've trodden on something that felt like glass." I brought the lamp to the place where he had been standing, close by the bed, and we both knelt on the floor, throwing the light of the lamp on the bare and dusty boards. Under the bed, just within reach of the foot of a person standing close by, was a little patch of fragments of glass. Thorndyke produced a piece of paper from his pocket and delicately swept the little fragments on to it, remarking, "By the look of things, I am not the first person who has trodden on that object, whatever it is. Do you mind holding the lamp while I inspect the remains?" I took the lamp and held it over the paper while he examined the little heap of glass through his lens. "Well," I asked, "what have you found?" "That is what I am asking myself," he replied. "As far as I can judge by the appearance of these fragments, they appear to be portions of a small watch glass. I wish there were some larger pieces." "Perhaps there are," said I. "Let us look about the floor under the bed." We resumed our groping about the dirty floor, throwing the light of the lamp on one spot after another. Presently, as we moved the lamp about, its light fell on a small glass bead, which I instantly picked up and exhibited to Thorndyke. "Is this of any interest to you?" I asked. Thorndyke took the bead and examined it curiously. "It is certainly," he said, "a very odd thing to find in the bedroom of an old bachelor like Jeffrey, especially as we know that he employed no woman to look after his rooms. Of course, it may be a relic of the last tenant. Let us see if there are any more." We renewed our search, crawling under the bed and throwing the light of the lamp in all directions over the floor. The result was the discovery of 3 more beads, one entire bugle, and the crushed remains of another, which had apparently been trodden on. All of these, including the fragments of the bugle that had been crushed, Thorndyke placed carefully on the paper, which he laid on the dressing table the more conveniently to examine our find. "I am sorry," said he, "that there are no more fragments of the watch glass, or whatever it was. The broken pieces were evidently picked up, with the exception of the one that I trod on, which was an isolated fragment that had been overlooked. As to the beads, judging by their number and the position in which we found some of them, that crushed bugle, for instance, they must have been dropped during Jeffrey's tenancy, and probably quite recently." "What sort of garment do you suppose they came from?" I asked. They may have been part of a beaded veil or the trimming of a dress, but the grouping rather suggests to me a tag of bead fringe. The color is rather unusual. I thought they looked like black beads." "So they do by this light, but I think that by daylight we shall find them to be a dark reddish brown. You can see the color now if you look at the smaller fragments of the one that is crushed." He handed me his lens, and when I had verified his statement he produced from his pocket a small tin box with a closely fitting lid, in which he deposited the paper, having first folded it up into a small parcel. "We will put the pencil in too," said he, and as he returned the box to his pocket he added, "You had better get one of these little boxes from Polton. It is often useful to have a safe receptacle for small and fragile articles." He folded up and replaced the dead man's clothes as we had found them. Then, observing a pair of shoes standing by the wall, he picked them up and looked them over thoughtfully, paying special attention to the backs of the soles and the fronts of the heels. "I suppose we may take it," said he, "that these are the shoes that poor Jeffrey wore on the night of his death. At any rate, there seem to be no others. He seems to have been a fairly clean walker. The streets were shockingly dirty that day, as I remember most distinctly. Do you see any slippers? I haven't noticed any." He opened and peeped into a cupboard in which an overcoat surmounted by a felt hat hung from a peg, like an attenuated suicide. He looked in all the corners and into the sitting room, but no slippers were to be seen. "Our friend seems to have had surprisingly little regard for comfort," Thorndyke remarked. "Think of spending the winter evenings in damp boots by a gas fire." "Perhaps the opium pipe compensated," said I, "or he may have gone to bed early." "But he did not. The night porter used to see the light in his rooms at 1 o'clock in the morning. In the sitting room, too, you remember. But he seems to have been in the habit of reading in bed, or perhaps smoking, for here is a candlestick with the remains of a whole dynasty of candles in it. As there is gas in the room, he couldn't have wanted the candle to undress by. He used stearine candles, too, not the common paraffin variety. I wonder why he went to that expense." "Perhaps the smell of the paraffin candles spoiled the aroma of the opium," I suggested, to which Thorndyke made no reply, but continued his inspection of the room, pulling out the drawer of the washstand, which contained a single worn out nail brush, and even picking up and examining the dry and cracked cake of soap in the dish. "He seems to have had a fair amount of clothing," said Thorndyke, who was now going through the chest of drawers, "though by the look of it he didn't change very often, and the shirts have a rather yellow and faded appearance. I wonder how he managed about his washing. Why, here are a couple of pairs of boots at the drawer with his clothes, and here is his stock of candles. Quite a large box, though nearly empty now, of stearine candles, 6 to the pound." He closed the drawer and cast another inquiring look round the room. "I think we have seen all now, Jervis," he said, "unless there is anything more that you would like to look into." "No," I replied. "I have seen all that I wanted to see, and more than I am able to attach any meaning to. So we may as well go." I blew out the lamp and put it in my overcoat pocket, and when we had turned out the gas in both rooms we took our departure. As we approached the lodge we found our stout friend in the act of retiring in favour of the night porter. Thorndyke handed him the key of the chambers, and after a few sympathetic inquiries about his health, which was obviously very indifferent, said, "Let me see. You were one of the witnesses to Mr. Blackmore's will, I think?" "I was, sir," replied the porter. "And I believe you read the document through before you witnessed the signature?" "I did, sir." "Did you read it aloud?" "Aloud, sir? Lor' bless you, no, sir. Why should I? The other witness read it, and of course Mr. Blackmore knew what was in it, seeing that it was in his own handwriting. What should I want to read it aloud for?" "No, of course you wouldn't want to. By the way, I have been wondering how Mr. Blackmore managed about his washing." The porter evidently regarded this question with some disfavour, for he replied only with an interrogative grunt. It was, in fact, rather an odd question. "Did you get it done for him?" Thorndyke pursued. "No, certainly not, sir. He got it done for himself. The laundry people used to deliver the basket here at the lodge, and Mr. Blackmore used to take it in with him when he happened to be passing." "It was not delivered at his chambers, then?" "No, sir. Mr. Blackmore was a very studious gentleman, and he didn't like to be disturbed. A studious gentleman would naturally not like to be disturbed." Thorndyke cordially agreed with these very proper sentiments, and finally wished the porter "good night." We passed out through the gateway into Wych Street, and, turning our faces eastward towards the Temple, set forth in silence, each thinking his own thoughts. What Thorndyke's were I cannot tell, though I have no doubt that he was busily engaged in piecing together all that he had seen and heard, and considering its possible application to the case in hand. As to me, my mind was in a whirl of confusion. All this searching and examining seemed to be the mere flogging of a dead horse. The will was obviously a perfectly valid and regular will, and there was an end of the matter. At least, so it seemed to me. But clearly that was not Thorndyke's view. His investigations were certainly not purposeless, and as I walked by his side trying to conceive some purpose in his actions, I only became more and more mystified as I recalled them one by one, and perhaps most of all by the cryptic questions that I had just heard him address to the equally mystified porter. End of Chapter 7, Part 2. Recording by James O'Connor, Randolph, Massachusetts, December 2009. Chapter 8 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 8. The Track Chart. As Thorndyke and I arrived at the main gateway of the Temple, and he swung round into the narrow lane, it was suddenly borne in on me that I had made no arrangements for the night. Events had followed one another so continuously, and each had been so engrossing, that I had lost sight of what I may call my domestic affairs. "We seem to be heading for your chambers, Thorndyke," I ventured to remark. "It is a little late to think of it, but I have not yet settled where I am to put up to night." "My dear fellow," he replied, "you are going to put up in your own bedroom, which has been waiting in readiness for you ever since you left it. Polton went up and inspected it as soon as you arrived. I take it that you will consider my chambers yours until such time as you may join the Benedictine majority and set up a home for yourself." "That is very handsome of you," said I. "You didn't mention that the billet you offered was a resident appointment." "Rooms and commons included," said Thorndyke; and when I protested that I should at least contribute to the costs of living, he impatiently waved the suggestion away. We were still arguing the question when we reached our chambers, as I will now call them, and a diversion was occasioned by my taking the lamp from my pocket and placing it on the table. "Ah," my colleague remarked, "that is a little reminder. We will put it on the mantelpiece for Polton to collect, and you shall give me a full account of your further adventures in the wilds of Kennington. That was a very odd affair. I have often wondered how it ended." He drew our two armchairs up to the fire, put on some more coal, placed the tobacco jar on the table exactly equidistant from the two chairs, and settled himself with the air of a man who is anticipating an agreeable entertainment. I filled my pipe, and, taking up the thread of the story where I had broken off on the last occasion, began to outline my later experiences. But he brought me up short. "Don't be sketchy, Jervis. To be sketchy is to be vague. Detail, my child. Detail is the soul of induction. Let us have all the facts. We can sort them out afterwards." I began afresh in a vein of the extremest circumstantiality. With deliberate malice I loaded a prolix narrative with every triviality that a fairly retentive memory could rake out of the half forgotten past. I cudgelled my brains for irrelevant incidents. I described with the minutest accuracy things that had not the faintest significance. I drew a vivid picture of the carriage inside and out. I painted a lifelike portrait of the horse, even going into particulars of the harness, which I was surprised to find that I had noticed. I described the furniture of the dining room and the cobwebs that had hung from the ceiling, the auction ticket on the chest of drawers, the rickety table, and the melancholy chairs. I gave the number per minute of the patient's respirations and the exact quantity of coffee consumed on each occasion, with an exhaustive description of the cup from which it was taken; and I left no personal details unconsidered, from the patient's finger nails to the roseate pimples on Mr. Weiss's nose. But my tactics of studied prolixity were a complete failure. The attempt to fatigue Thorndyke's brain with superabundant detail was like trying to surfeit a pelican with white bait. He consumed it all with calm enjoyment and asked for more; and when, at last, I did really begin to think that I had bored him a little, he staggered me by reading over his notes and starting a brisk cross examination to elicit fresh facts. And the most surprising thing of all was that when I had finished, I seemed to know a great deal more about the case than I had ever known before. "It was a very remarkable affair," he observed, when the cross examination was over, leaving me somewhat in the condition of a cider apple that has just been removed from a hydraulic press. "A very suspicious affair, with a highly unsatisfactory end. I am not sure that I entirely agree with your police officer, nor do I fancy that some of my acquaintances at Scotland Yard would have agreed with him." "Do you think I ought to have taken any further measures?" I asked uneasily. "No, I don't see how you could. You did all that was possible under the circumstances. You gave information which is all that a private individual can do, especially if he is an overworked general practitioner. But still, an actual crime is the affair of every good citizen. I think we ought to take some action." "You think there really was a crime, then?" "What else can one think? What do you think about it yourself?" "I don't like to think about it at all. The recollection of that corpse like figure in that gloomy bedroom has haunted me ever since I left the house. What do you suppose has happened?" Thorndyke did not answer for a few seconds. At length he said gravely: "I am afraid, Jervis, that the answer to that question can be given in one word." "Murder?" I asked, with a slight shudder. He nodded, and we were both silent for a while. "The probability," he resumed after a pause, "that Mr. Graves is alive at this moment seems to me infinitesimal. There was evidently a conspiracy to murder him, and the deliberate, persistent manner in which that object was being pursued points to a very strong and definite motive." "Then the tactics adopted point to considerable forethought and judgment. They are not the tactics of a fool or an ignoramus. We may criticize the closed carriage as a tactical mistake, calculated to arouse suspicion, but we have to weigh it against its alternative." "What is that?" "Well, consider the circumstances. Suppose Weiss had called you in the ordinary way. You would still have detected the use of poison. But now you could have located your man and made inquiries about him in the neighborhood. You would probably have given the police a hint, and they would almost certainly have taken action, as they would have had the means of identifying the parties. The result would have been fatal to Weiss. The closed carriage invited suspicion, but it was a great safeguard. Weiss's methods were not so unsound after all. He is a cautious man, but cunning and very persistent, and he could be bold on occasion. The use of the blinded carriage was a decidedly audacious proceeding. I should put him down as a gambler of a very discreet, courageous, and resourceful type. Which all leads to the probability that he has pursued his scheme and brought it to a successful issue. I'm afraid it does. But have you got your notes of the compass bearings?" "The book is in my overcoat pocket with the board. I will fetch them." I went into the office where our coats hung and brought back the notebook with the little board to which it was still attached by the rubber band. Thorndyke took them from me, and, opening the book, ran his eye quickly down one page after another. Suddenly he glanced at the clock. "It is a little late to begin," said he, "but these notes look rather alluring. I am inclined to plot them out at once. I fancy from their appearance that they will enable us to locate the house without much difficulty. But don't let me keep you up if you are tired. I can work them out by myself." "You won't do anything of the kind!" I exclaimed. "I am as keen on plotting them as you are, and besides, I want to see how it is done. It seems to be a rather useful accomplishment." "It is," said Thorndyke. "In our work the ability to make a rough but reliable sketch survey is often of great value. Have you ever looked over these notes?" "No. I put the book away when I came in and have never looked at it since." "It is a quaint document. You seem to be rich in railway bridges in those parts, and the route was certainly none of the most direct, as you noticed at the time. However, we will plot it out, and then we shall see exactly what it looks like and whither it leads us." He retired to the laboratory and presently returned with a T-square, a military protractor, a pair of dividers, and a large drawing board, on which was pinned a sheet of cartridge paper. "Now," said he, seating himself at the table with the board before him, "as to the method. You started from a known position, and you arrived at a place the position of which is at present unknown. We shall fix the position of that spot by applying two factors: the distance that you travelled and the direction in which you were moving. The direction is given by the compass, and, as the horse seems to have kept up a remarkably even pace, we can take time as representing distance. You seem to have been travelling at about 8 miles an hour. That is roughly a seventh of a mile in 1 minute. So, if on our chart we take 1 inch as representing 1 minute, we shall be working with a scale of about 7 inches to the mile." "That doesn't sound very exact as to distance," I objected. "It isn't, but that doesn't matter much. We have certain landmarks, such as these railway arches that you have noted, by which the actual distance can be settled after the route is plotted. You had better read out the entries, and, opposite each, write a number for reference, so that we need not confuse the chart by writing details on it. I shall start near the middle of the board, as neither you nor I seem to have the slightest notion what your general direction was." I laid the open notebook before me and read out the first entry: 8:58 west by south. Start from home. Horse 13 hands. "You turned round at once, I understand," said Thorndyke. "So we draw no line in that direction. The next is 8:58 30 east by north, and the next is 8:59 northeast. Then you travelled east by north about a 15th of a mile, and we shall put down half an inch on the chart. Then you turned northeast. How long did you go on?" "Exactly a minute. The next entry is 9 west northwest. Then you travelled about the 7th of a mile in a northeasterly direction, and we draw a line an inch long at an angle of 45° to the right of the north and south line. From the end of that we carry a line at an angle of 56¼ to the left of the north and south line, and so on. The method is perfectly simple, you see." "Perfectly. I quite understand it now." I went back to my chair and continued to read out the entries from the notebook, while Thorndyke laid off the lines of directions with the protractor, taking out the distances with the dividers from a scale of equal parts on the back of the instrument. As the work proceeded, I noticed from time to time a smile of quiet amusement spread over my colleague's keen, attentive face, and at each new reference to a railway bridge he chuckled softly. "What again?" he laughed, as I recorded the passage of the 5th or 6th bridge. "It's like a game of croquet. Go on. What is the next?" I went on reading out the notes until I came to the final one: 9:24 southeast, in covered way. Stop. Wooden gates closed." Thorndyke ruled off the last line, remarking, "Then your covered way is on the south side of a street which bears northeast. So we complete our chart. Just look at your route, Jervis." He held up the board with a quizzical smile, and I stared in astonishment at the chart. The single line which represented the route of the carriage zigzagged in the most amazing manner, turning, returning, and crossing itself repeatedly, evidently passing more than once down the same thoroughfares and terminating at a comparatively short distance from its commencement. "Why," I exclaimed, "the rascal must have lived quite near to Stillbury's house." Thorndyke measured with the dividers the distance between the starting and arriving points of the route and took it off from the scale. 5/8 of a mile roughly, he said. "You could have walked it in less than 10 minutes. And now let us get out the ordnance map and see if we can give to each of those marvellously erratic lines a local habitation and a name." He spread the map out on the table and placed our chart by its side. "I think," said he, "you started from Lower Kennington Lane." "Yes, from this point," I replied, indicating the spot with a pencil. "Then," said Thorndyke, "if we swing the chart round 20° to correct the deviation of the compass, we can compare it with the ordnance map." He set off with the protractor an angle of 20° from the north and south line, and turned the chart round to that extent. After closely scrutinizing the map and the chart, and comparing the one with the other, he said: "By mere inspection it seems fairly easy to identify the thoroughfares that correspond to the lines of the chart. Take the part that is near your destination. At 9:21 you passed under a bridge going westward. That would seem to be Glasshouse Street. Then you turned south, apparently along the Albert Embankment, where you heard the tug's whistle. Then you heard a passenger train start on your left. That would be Vauxhall Station. Next you turned round due east and passed under a large railway bridge, which suggests the bridge that carries the station over Upper Kennington Lane. If that is so, your house should be on the south side of Upper Kennington Lane, some 300 yards from the bridge. But we may as well test our inferences by one or two measurements. How can you do that if you don't know the exact scale of the chart? I will show you, said Thorndyke. We shall establish the true scale, and that will form part of the proof. He rapidly constructed on the upper blank part of the paper a proportional diagram consisting of two intersecting lines with a single cross line. This long line, he explained, is the distance from Stilbury's house to the Vauxhall Railway Bridge as it appears on the chart. The shorter cross line is the same distance taken from the ordnance map. If our inference is correct, and the chart is reasonably accurate, all the other distances will show a similar proportion. Let us try some of them. Take the distance from Vauxhall Bridge to the Glasshouse Street Bridge. Opening bracket, illustration, : the track chart showing the route followed by Weiss's carriage. A period. Starting point in Lower Kennington Lane. B period. Position of Mr. Weiss's house. The dotted lines connecting the bridges indicate probable railway lines. Closing bracket. He made the two measurements carefully, and as the point of the dividers came down almost precisely in the correct place on the diagram, he looked up at me. Considering the roughness of the method by which the chart was made, I think that is pretty conclusive, though, if you look at the various arches that you passed under and see how nearly they appear to follow the position of the South-Western Railway line, you hardly need further proof. But I will take a few more proportional measurements for the satisfaction of proving the case by scientific methods before we proceed to verify our conclusions by a visit to the spot. He took off one or two more distances, and on comparing them with the proportional distances on the ordnance map, found them in every case as nearly correct as could be expected. "Yes," said Thorndyke, laying down the dividers, "I think we have narrowed down the locality of Mr. Weiss's house to a few yards in a known street. We shall get further help from your note of 9:23:30, when records a patch of newly laid macadam extending up to the house." "That new macadam will be pretty well smoothed down by now," I objected. "Not so very completely," answered Thorndyke. "It is only a little over a month ago, and there has been very little wet weather since. It may be smooth, but it will be easily distinguishable from the old." "And do I understand that you propose to go and explore the neighbourhood?" "Undoubtedly I do. That is to say, I intend to convert the locality of this house into a definite address, which I think will now be perfectly easy, unless we should have the bad luck to find more than one covered way. Even then the difficulty would be trifling." "And when you have ascertained where Mr. Weiss lives, what then?" "That will depend on circumstances. I think we shall probably call at Scotland Yard and have a little talk with our friend Mr. Superintendent Miller, unless, for any reason, it seems better to look into the case ourselves." "When is this voyage of exploration to take place?" Thorndyke considered this question, and taking out his pocket-book glanced through his engagements. "It seems to me," he said, "that to-morrow is a fairly free day. We could take the morning without neglecting other business. I suggest that we start immediately after breakfast. How will that suit my learned friend?" "My time is yours," I replied, "and if you choose to waste it on matters that don't concern you, that's your affair." "Then we will consider the arrangement to stand for to-morrow morning, or rather for this morning, as I see that it is past 12." With this Thorndyke gathered up the chart and instruments, and we separated for the night. End of Chapter 8. Recording by James O'Connor. Randolph, Massachusetts, January, 2010. Chapter 9 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James O'Connor. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 9. The House of Mystery. 9:30 on the following morning found us spinning along the Albert Embankment in a hansom to the pleasant tinkle of the horse's bell. Thorndyke appeared to be in high spirits, though the full enjoyment of the matutinal pipe precluded fluent conversation. As a precaution, he had put my notebook in his pocket before starting, and once or twice he took it out and looked over its pages. But he made no reference to the object of our quest, and the few remarks that he uttered would have indicated that his thoughts were occupied with other matters. Arrived at Vauxhall Station, we alighted, and forthwith made our way to the bridge that spans Upper Kennington Lane near its junction with Harleyford Road. "Here is our starting point," said Thorndyke. "From this place to the house is about 300 yards, say 420 paces, and at about 200 paces we ought to reach our patch of new road metal. Now, are you ready? If we keep step we shall average our stride." We started together at a good pace, stepping out with military regularity and counting aloud as we went. As we told out the 194th pace, I observed Thorndyke nod towards the roadway a little ahead, and looking at it attentively as we approached, it was easy to see by the regularity of surface and lighter colour that it had recently been remetalled. Having counted out the 420 paces, we halted, and Thorndyke turned to me with a smile of triumph. "Not a bad estimate, Jervis," said he. "That will be your house, if I am not much mistaken. There is no other mews or private roadway in sight." He pointed to a narrow turning some dozen yards ahead, apparently the entrance to a mews or yard, and closed by a pair of massive wooden gates. "Yes," I answered, "there can be no doubt that this is the place. But, by Jove," I added as we drew nearer, "the nest is empty. Do you see?" I pointed to a bill that was stuck on the gate, bearing, as I could see at this distance, the inscription, "To Let." "Here is a new and startling, if not altogether unexpected development," said Thorndyke, as we stood gazing at the bill, which set forth that, "these premises, including stabling and workshops, were to be let on lease or otherwise," and referred inquiries to Messrs. Ryebody Brothers, house agents and valuers, Upper Kennington Lane. "The question is, should we make a few inquiries of the agent, or should we get the keys and have a look at the inside of the house? I am inclined to do both, and the latter first, if Messrs. Ryebody Brothers will trust us with the keys." We proceeded up the lane to the address given, and, entering the office, Thorndyke made his request, somewhat to the surprise of the clerk, for Thorndyke was not quite the kind of person whom one naturally associates with stabling and workshops. However, there was no difficulty, but as the clerk sorted out the keys from a bunch hanging from a hook, he remarked: "I expect you will find the place in a rather dirty and neglected condition. The house has not been cleaned yet. It is just as it was left when the brokers took away the furniture." "Was the last tenant sold up, then?" Thorndyke asked. "Oh, no. He had to leave rather unexpectedly to take up some business in Germany." "I hope he paid his rent," said Thorndyke. "Oh, yes. Trust us for that. But I should say that Mr. Weiss, that was his name, was a man of some means. He seemed to have plenty of money, though he always paid in notes. I don't fancy he had a banking account in this country. He hadn't been here more than about 6 or 7 months, and I imagine he didn't know many people in England, as he paid us a cash deposit in lieu of references when he first came." "I think you said his name was Weiss. It wouldn't be H. Weiss by any chance?" "I believe it was, but I can soon tell you." He opened a drawer and consulted what looked like a book of receipt forms. "Yes, H. Weiss. Do you know him, sir?" "I knew a Mr. H. Weiss some years ago. He came from Bremen, I remember." "This Mr. Weiss has gone back to Hamburg," the clerk observed. "Ah," said Thorndyke. "Then it would not seem to be the same. My acquaintance was a fair man with a beard and a decidedly red nose, and he wore spectacles." "That's the man. You've described him exactly," said the clerk, who was apparently rather easily satisfied in the matter of description. "Dear me," said Thorndyke, "what a small world it is! Do you happen to have a note of his address in Hamburg?" "I haven't," the clerk replied. "You see, we've done with him, having got the rent, though the house is not actually surrendered yet. Mr. Weiss's housekeeper still has the front door key. She doesn't start for Hamburg for a week or so, and meanwhile she keeps the key so that she can call every day and see if there are any letters." "Indeed!" said Thorndyke. "I wonder if he still has the same housekeeper." "This lady is a German," replied the clerk, "with a regular jaw-twisting name. Sounded like Shallybang." "Schallibaum? That is the lady. A fair woman with hardly any eyebrows and a pronounced cast in the left eye." "Now that's very curious, sir," said the clerk. "It's the same name, and this is a fair woman with remarkably thin eyebrows. I remember, now that you mention it. But it can't be the same person. I have only seen her a few times, and then only just for a minute or so. But I'm quite certain she had no cast in her eye. So you see, sir, she can't be the same person. You can dye your hair, or you can wear a wig, or you can paint your face, but a squint is a squint. There's no faking a swivel eye." Thorndyke laughed softly. "I suppose not, unless, perhaps, some one might invent an adjustable glass eye. Are these the keys?" "Yes, sir. The large one belongs to the wicket in the front gate. The other is the latchkey belonging to the side door. Mrs. Shallybang has the key of the front door." "Thank you," said Thorndyke. He took the keys, to which a wooden label was attached, and we made our way back towards the house of mystery, discussing the clerk's statements as we went. "A very communicable young gentleman, that," Thorndyke remarked. "He seemed quite pleased to relieve the monotony of office work with a little conversation, and I am sure I was very delighted to indulge him." "He hadn't much to tell, all the same," said I. Thorndyke looked at me in surprise. "I don't know what you would have, Jervis, unless you expect casual strangers to present you with a ready-made body of evidence, fully classified, with all the inferences and implications stated. It seemed to me that he was a highly instructive young man. "What did you learn from him?" I asked. "Oh, come, Jervis," he protested. "Is that a fair question under our present arrangement? However, I will mention a few points. We learn that about 6 or 7 months ago Mr. H. Weiss dropped from the clouds into Kennington Lane, and that he has now ascended from Kennington Lane into the clouds. That is a useful piece of information. Then we learn that Mrs. Schallibaum has remained in England, which might be of little importance if it were not for a very interesting corollary that it suggests." "What is that?" "I must leave you to consider the facts at your leisure, but you will have noticed the ostensible reason for her remaining behind. She is engaged in puttying up the one gaping joint in their armour. One of them has been indiscreet enough to give this address to some correspondent, probably a foreign correspondent. Now, as they obviously wish to leave no tracks, they cannot give their new address to the post office to have their letters forwarded, and, on the other hand, a letter left in the box might establish such a connection as would enable them to be traced. Moreover, the letter might be of a kind that they would not wish to fall into the wrong hands. They would not have given this address excepting under some peculiar circumstances." "No, I should think not, if they took this house for the express purpose of committing a crime in it." "Exactly. And then there is one other fact that you may have gathered from our young friend's remarks." "What is that?" "That a controllable squint is a very valuable asset to a person who wishes to avoid identification." "Yes, I did note that. The fellow seemed to think that it was absolutely conclusive." "And so would most people, especially in the case of a squint of that kind. We can all squint towards our noses, but no normal person can turn his eyes away from one another. My impression is that the presence or absence, as the case might be, of a divergent squint would be accepted as absolute disproof of identity. But here we are." He inserted the key into the wicket of the large gate, and when we had stepped through into the covered way, he locked it from the inside. "Why have you locked us in?" I asked, seeing that the wicket had a latch. "Because," he replied, "if we now hear any one on the premises, we shall know who it is. Only one person besides ourselves has a key." His reply startled me somewhat. I stopped and looked at him. "That is a quaint situation, Thorndyke. I hadn't thought of it. Why, she may actually come to the house while we are here. In fact, she may be in the house at this moment." "I hope not," said he. "We don't particularly want Mr. Weiss to be put on his guard, for I take it he is a pretty wide awake gentleman under any circumstances. If she does come, we had better keep out of sight. I think we will look over the house first. That is of the most interest to us. If the lady does happen to come while we are here, she may stay to show us over the place and keep an eye on us. So we will leave the stables to the last." We walked down the entry to the side door, at which I had been admitted by Mrs. Schallibaum on the occasion of my previous visits. Thorndyke inserted the latch key, and, as soon as we were inside, shut the door and walked quickly through into the hall, whither I followed him. He made straight for the front door, where, having slipped up the catch of the lock, he began very attentively to examine the letter box. It was a somewhat massive wooden box, fitted with a lock of good quality, and furnished with a wire grille through which one could inspect the interior. "We are in luck, Jervis," Thorndyke remarked. "Our visit has been most happily timed. There is a letter in the box." "Well," I said, "we can't get it out, and if we could, it would be hardly justifiable." "I don't know," he replied, "that I am prepared to assent off hand to either of those propositions. But I would rather not tamper with another person's letter, even if that person should happen to be a murderer. Perhaps we can get the information we want from the outside of the envelope." He produced from his pocket a little electric lamp fitted with a bull's eye, and, pressing the button, threw a beam of light in through the grille. The letter was lying on the bottom of the box, face upwards, so that the address could easily be read. "Herren Dr. H. Weiss," Thorndyke read aloud. "German stamp. Postmark apparently Darmstadt. You notice that the Herren Doktor is printed and the rest written. What do you make of that?" "I don't quite know. Do you think he is really a medical man?" "Perhaps we had better finish our investigation, in case we are disturbed, and discuss the bearings of the facts afterwards. The name of the sender may be on the flap of the envelope. If it is not, I shall pick the lock and take out the letter. Have you got a probe about you?" "Yes. By force of habit I am still carrying my pocket case." I took the little case from my pocket and, extracting from it a jointed probe of thickish silver wire, screwed the two halves together and handed the completed instrument to Thorndyke, who passed the slender rod through the grille and adroitly turned the letter over. "Ah!" he exclaimed with deep satisfaction as the light fell on the reverse of the envelope. "We are saved from the necessity of theft, or rather unauthorized borrowing. Johann Schnitzler, Darmstadt. That is all that we actually want. The German police can do the rest, if necessary." He handed me back my probe, pocketed his lamp, released the catch of the lock on the door, and turned away along the dark, musty smelling hall. "Do you happen to know the name of Johann Schnitzler?" he asked. I replied that I had no recollection of ever having heard the name before. "Neither have I," said he, "but I think we may form a pretty shrewd guess as to his avocation. As you saw, the words 'Herren Doktor' were printed on the envelope, leaving the rest of the address to be written by hand. The plain inference is that he is a person who habitually addresses letters to medical men, and, as the style of the envelope and the lettering, which is printed, not embossed, is commercial, we may assume that he is engaged in some sort of trade. Now, what is a likely trade? He might be an instrument maker or a drug manufacturer, more probably the latter, as there is an extensive drug and chemical industry in Germany, and as Mr. Weiss seemed to have more use for drugs than instruments. Yes, I think you are right, but we will look him up when we get home. And now we had better take a glance at the bedroom, that is, if you can remember which room it was." "It was on the first floor," said I, "and the door by which I entered was just at the head of the stairs." We ascended the 2 flights, and as we reached the landing I halted. "This was the door," I said, and was about to turn the handle when Thorndyke caught me by the arm. "One moment, Jervis," said he. "What do you make of this?" He pointed to a spot near the bottom of the door where, on close inspection, 4 good sized screw holes were distinguishable. They had been neatly stopped with putty and covered with knotting, and were so nearly the colour of the grained and varnished woodwork as to be hardly visible. "Evidently," I answered, "there has been a bolt there, though it seems a queer place to fix one." "Not at all," replied Thorndyke. "If you look up you will see that there was another at the top of the door, and as the lock is in the middle, they must have been highly effective. but there are one or two other points that strike one. First, you will notice that the bolts have been fixed on quite recently, for the paint that they covered is of the same grimy tint as that on the rest of the door. Next, they have been taken off, which, seeing that they could hardly have been worth the trouble of removal, seems to suggest that the person who fixed them considered that their presence might appear remarkable, while the screw holes, which have been so skilfully and carefully stopped, would be less conspicuous. Then, they are on the outside of the door, an unusual situation for bedroom bolts, and were of considerable size. They were long and thick. I can see by the position of the screw holes that they were long, but how do you arrive at their thickness? By the size of the counter holes in the jamb of the door. These holes have been very carefully filled with wooden plugs covered with knotting, but you can make out their diameter, which is that of the bolts, and which is decidedly out of proportion for an ordinary bedroom door. Let me show you a light." He flashed his lamp into the dark corner, and I was able to see distinctly the portentously large holes into which the bolts had fitted, and also to note the remarkable neatness with which they had been plugged. "There was a second door, I remember," said I. "Let us see if that was guarded in a similar manner." We strode through the empty room, awakening dismal echoes as we trod the bare boards, and flung open the other door. At top and bottom, similar groups of screw holes showed that this also had been made secure, and that these bolts had been of the same very substantial character as the others. Thorndyke turned away from the door with a slight frown. "If we had any doubts," said he, "as to what has been going on in this house, these traces of massive fastenings would be almost enough to settle them." "They might have been there before Weiss came," I suggested. "He only came about 7 months ago, and there is no date on the screw holes." "That is quite true; but when, with their recent fixture, you couple the facts that they have been removed, that very careful measures have been taken to obliterate the traces of their presence, and that they would have been indispensable for the commission of the crime that we are almost certain was being committed here, it looks like an excess of caution to seek other explanations." "But," I objected, "if the man Graves was really imprisoned, could not he have smashed the window and called for help?" "The window looks out on the yard, as you see, but I expect it was secured too." He drew the massive, old fashioned shutters out of their recess and closed them. "Yes, here we are." He pointed to 4 groups of screw holes at the corners of the shutters, and, once more producing his lamp, narrowly examined the insides of the recesses into which the shutters folded. "The nature of the fastening is quite evident," said he. "An iron bar passed right across at the top and bottom, and was secured by a staple and padlock. You can see the mark the bar made in the recess when the shutters were folded. When these bars were fixed and padlocked and the bolts were shot, this room was as secure, for a prisoner unprovided with tools, as a cell in Newgate." We looked at one another for a while without speaking, and I fancy that if Mr. H. Weiss could have seen our faces, he might have thought it desirable to seek some retreat even more remote than Hamburg. "It was a diabolical affair, Jervis," Thorndyke said at length in an ominously quiet and even gentle tone. "A sordid, callous, cold-blooded crime of a type that is to me utterly unforgivable and incapable of extenuation. Of course it may have failed. Mr. Graves may even now be alive. I shall make it my very especial business to ascertain whether he is or not, and if he is not, I shall take it to myself as a sacred duty to lay my hand on the man who has compassed his death." I looked at Thorndyke with something akin to awe. In the quiet, unemotional tone of his voice, in his unruffled manner, and the stony calm of his face, there was something much more impressive, more fateful, than there could have been in the fiercest threats or the most passionate denunciations. I felt that in those softly spoken words he had pronounced the doom of the fugitive villain. He turned away from the window and glanced round the empty room. It seemed that our discovery of the fastenings had exhausted the information that it had to offer. "It is a thousand pities," I remarked, "that we were unable to look round before they moved out the furniture. We might have found some clue to the scoundrel's identity." "Yes," replied Thorndyke. "There isn't much information to be gathered here, I am afraid. I see they have swept up the small litter from the floor and poked it under the grate. We will turn that over, as there seems to be nothing else, and then look at the other rooms." He raked out the little heap of rubbish with his stick and spread it out on the hearth. It certainly looked unpromising enough, being just such a rubbish heap as may be swept up in any untidy room during a move. But Thorndyke went through it systematically, examining each item attentively, even to the local tradesmen's bills and empty paper bags, before laying them aside. Another rake of his stick scattered the bulky masses of crumpled paper and brought into view an object which he picked up with some eagerness. It was a portion of a pair of spectacles, which had apparently been trodden on, for the side bar was twisted and bent, and the glass was shattered into fragments. "This ought to give us a hint," said he. "It will probably have belonged either to Weiss or Graves, as Mrs. Schallibaum apparently did not wear glasses. Let us see if we can find the remainder." We both groped carefully with our sticks amongst the rubbish, spreading it out on the hearth and removing the numerous pieces of crumpled paper. Our search was rewarded by the discovery of the second eyepiece of the spectacles, of which the glass was badly cracked but less shattered than the other. I also picked up two tiny sticks, at which Thorndyke looked with deep interest before laying them on the mantelshelf. "We will consider them presently," said he. "Let us finish with the spectacles first. You see that the left eyeglass is a concave cylindrical lens of some sort. We can make out that much from the fragments that remain, and we can measure the curvature when we get them home, although that will be easier if we can collect some more fragments and stick them together. The right eye is plain glass. That is quite evident. Then these will have belonged to your patient, Jervis. You said that the tremulous iris was in the right eye, I think." "Yes," I replied. "These will be his spectacles without doubt." "They are peculiar frames," he continued. "If they were made in this country we might be able to discover the maker, but we must collect as many fragments of glass as we can." Once more we searched amongst the rubbish and succeeded eventually in recovering some 7 or 8 small fragments of the broken spectacle glasses, which Thorndyke laid on the mantelshelf beside the little sticks. "By the way, Thorndyke," I said, taking up the ladder to examine them afresh, "what are these things? Can you make anything of them?" He looked at them thoughtfully for a few moments and then replied: "I don't think I will tell you what they are. You should find that out for yourself, and it will be well worth your while to do so. They are rather suggestive objects under the circumstances. But notice their peculiarities carefully. Both are portions of some smooth, stout reed. There is a long, thin stick, about 6 inches long, and a thicker piece, only 3 inches in length. The longer piece has a little scrap of red paper stuck on at the end, apparently a portion of a label of some kind with an ornamental border. The other end of the stick has been broken off. The shorter, stouter stick has had its central cavity artificially enlarged, so that it fits over the other to form a cap or sheath. Make a careful note of those facts, and try to think what they probably mean. What would be the most likely use for an object of this kind? When you have ascertained that, you will have learned something new about this case. And now, to resume our investigations, here is a very suggestive thing." He picked up a small, wide-mouthed bottle, and, holding it up for my inspection, continued: "Observe the fly sticking to the inside, and the name on the label: Fox, Russell Street, Covent Garden." "I don't know Mr. Fox." "Then I will inform you that he is a dealer in the materials for make up, theatrical or otherwise, and will leave you to consider the bearing of this bottle on our present investigation. There doesn't seem to be anything else of interest in this Eldorado excepting that screw, which you notice is about the size of those with which the bolts were fastened on the doors. I don't think it is worth while to unstop any of the holes to try it. We should learn nothing fresh." He rose, and, having kicked the discarded rubbish back under the grate, gathered up his gleanings from the mantelpiece, carefully bestowing the spectacles and the fragments of glass in the tin box that he appeared always to carry in his pocket, and wrapping the larger objects in his handkerchief. "A poor collection," was his comment, as he returned the box and handkerchief to his pocket, "and yet not so poor as I had feared. Perhaps, if we question them closely enough, these unconsidered trifles may be made to tell us something worth learning after all. Shall we go into the other room?" We passed out on to the landing and into the front room, where, guided by experience, we made straight for the fireplace. But the little heap of rubbish there contained nothing that even Thorndyke's inquisitive eye could view with interest. We wandered disconsolately around the room, peering into the empty cupboards and scanning the floor and the corners by the skirting, without discovering a single object or relic of the late occupants. In the course of my perambulations I halted by the window, and was looking down into the street when Thorndyke called to me sharply: "Come away from the window, Jervis. Have you forgotten that Mrs. Schallibaum may be in the neighbourhood at this moment?" As a matter of fact, I had entirely forgotten the matter, nor did it now strike me as anything but the remotest of possibilities. I replied to that effect. "I don't agree with you," Thorndyke rejoined. "We have heard that she comes here to look for letters. Probably she comes every day, or even oftener. There is a good deal at stake, remember, and they cannot feel quite as secure as they would wish. Weiss must have seen what view you took of the case, and must have had some uneasy moments thinking of what you might do. In fact, we may take it that the fear of you drove them out of the neighbourhood, and that they are mighty anxious to get that letter and cut the last link that binds them to this house." "I suppose that is so," I agreed. "And if the lady should happen to pass this way, and should see me at the window and recognize me, she would certainly smell a rat." "A rat!" exclaimed Thorndyke. "She would smell a whole pack of foxes, and Mr. H. Weiss would be more on his guard than ever. Let us have a look at the other rooms. There is nothing here." We went up to the next floor and found traces of recent occupation in one room only. The garrets had evidently been unused, and the kitchen and ground floor rooms offered nothing that appeared to Thorndyke worth noting. Then we went out by the side door and down the covered way into the yard at the back. The workshops were fastened with rusty padlocks that looked as if they had not been disturbed for months. The stables were empty and had been tentatively cleaned out. The coach house was vacant and presented no traces of recent use excepting a half bald spoke brush. We returned up the covered way, and I was about to close the side door, which Thorndyke had left ajar, when he stopped me. "We'll have another look at the hall before we go," said he, and, walking softly before me, he made his way to the front door, where, producing his lamp, he threw a beam of light into the letter box. "Any more letters?" I asked. "Any more?" he repeated. "Look for yourself." I stooped and peered through the grille into the lighted interior, and then I uttered an exclamation. The box was empty. Thorndyke regarded me with a grim smile. "We have been caught on the hop, Jervis, I suspect," said he. "It is queer," I replied. "I didn't hear any sound of the opening or closing of the door, did you?" "No, I didn't hear any sound, which makes me suspect that she did. She would have heard our voices, and she is probably keeping a sharp lookout at this very moment. I wonder if she saw you at the window. But whether she did or not, we must go very warily. Neither of us must return to the Temple direct, and we had better separate when we have returned the keys, and I will watch you out of sight and see if any one is following you. What are you going to do?" "If you don't want me, I shall run over to Kensington and drop in to lunch at the Hornbys'. I said I would call as soon as I had an hour or so free." "Very well. Do so, and keep a lookout in case you are followed. I have to go down to Guildford this afternoon. Under the circumstances, I shall not go back home, but send Polton a telegram and take a train at Vauxhall, and change at some small station where I can watch the platform. Be as careful as you can. Remember that what you have to avoid is being followed to any place where you are known, and, above all, revealing your connection with No. 5A, King's Bench Walk." Having thus considered our immediate movements, we emerged together from the wicket, and, locking it behind us, walked quickly to the house agent's, where an opportune office boy received the keys without remark. As we came out of the office, I halted irresolutely, and we both looked up and down the lane. "There is no suspicious looking person in sight at present," Thorndyke said, and then asked, "Which way do you think of going?" "It seems to me," I replied, "that my best plan would be to take a cab or an omnibus so as to get out of the neighbourhood as quickly as possible. If I go through Ravensden Street into Kennington Park Road, I can pick up an omnibus that will take me to the Mansion House, where I can change for Kensington. I shall go on the top, so that I can keep a lookout for any other omnibus or cab that may be following." "Yes," said Thorndyke, "that seems a good plan. I will walk with you and see that you get a fair start." We walked briskly along the lane and through Ravensden Street to the Kennington Park Road. An omnibus was approaching from the south at a steady jog trot, and we halted at the corner to wait for it. Several people passed us in different directions, but none seemed to take any particular notice of us, though we observed them rather narrowly, especially the women. Then the omnibus crawled up. I sprang on the footboard and ascended to the roof, where I seated myself and surveyed the prospect to the rear. No one else got on the omnibus, which had not stopped, and no cab or other passenger vehicle was in sight. I continued to watch Thorndyke as he stood sentinel at the corner, and noted that no one appeared to be making any effort to overtake the omnibus. Presently my colleague waved his hand to me and turned back towards Vauxhall, and I, having satisfied myself once more that no pursuing cab or hurrying foot passenger was in sight, decided that our precautions had been unnecessary, and settled myself in a rather more comfortable position. Chapter 10. James O'Connor. Randolph, Massachusetts, April 2010.